Hey everyone, this is day 37th of my communication practice, and in the last 36 video, I was able to complete the part A and part B of the book, and we were able to understand how the author's experienced and how he saw people transitioning in the camp, in the concentration camp in Nazi Germany. And then he talked about his logotherapy and how it is different from psychotherapy. So it was actually quite a journey, eventful journey, where I was able to see see the transition in my voice, the confidence, how I am speaking. Still, it's not up to that mark which I want and aspire my voice to be. And now we are at the postscript of the book. Here, the author will talk about the other things that have been said in the book. So I'll just start reading here, and I think it would take another 2 days to complete this postscript part, and this calls for a case for a tragic optimism. Let us first ask ourselves what should be understood by a tragic optimism. In brief, it means that one is and remains optimistic in spite of the tragic triad, as it is called in logotherapy. A triad which consists of these aspects of human existence which may be circumscribed by pain, guilt, and death. This chapter, in fact, raises the question, how is it possible to say yes to life in spite of all that? How to pose the question differently, can life certainly can life retain its potential meaning in spite of the tragic aspects? After all, saying yes to life in spite of everything, to use a phrase in which the title of a German book of mine is couched, presupposes that life is potentially meaningful under any conditions, even those which are not which are most miserable. And this presupposes the human capacity to creatively turn life's negative aspects into something positive or constructive. In other words, what matters is make the best of any given situation. The best, however, is that which in Latin is called optimum. Hence, the reason I speak of a tragic optimism, that is, optimism in the face of tragedy and in view of the human potential, which at its best always allows for turning suffering into human achievement and accomplishment. Second, deriving from guilt the opportunity to change oneself for better. And third, deriving from life's transitoriness an incentive to make responsible action. It must be kept in mind, however, that optimism is not anything to be commanded or ordered. One cannot even force oneself to be optimistic indiscriminately, against all odds, against all hope. And what is true for hope is also true for the other two components of the triad, in as much as faith and love cannot be commanded or ordered either. To the European, it is a characteristic of the American culture that again and again one is commanded and ordered to be happy. But happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. One must have the reason to be happy. Once the reason is found, however, one becomes happy automatically. As we see, a human being is not in pursuit of happiness but rather in search of a reason to become happy. Last but not the least, the through actualizing the potential meaning inherent and dormant in a given situation. This need for a reason is similar in another specifically human phenomenon, laughter. If you want anyone to laugh, you have to provide him with a reason. That is, you have to tell him a joke. In no way it is possible to evoke real laughter by urging him or having him urge himself to laugh. Doing so would be the same as urging people posed in front of camera to say cheese, or only to find that in the finished photographs their phrases are frozen in artificial smiles. In logotherapy, such a behavior pattern is called hyperintention. It plays an important role in the causation of sexual neurosis, be it frigid or impotence. The more a patient, instead of forgetting himself through giving himself direct strikes of orgasm, that is the pleasure, the more this pursuit of sexual pleasure becomes self-defeating. Indeed, what is called the pleasure principle is rather a fun spoiler. Once an individual's search for meaning is successful, it not only renders him happy but also gives him the capability to cope with suffering. And what happens if one groping for meaning has been in vain? This may well result in a fatal condition. Let us recall, for instance, what sometimes happen to in extreme situations such as prisoner of war camps or concentration camps. In the first, I was told by American soldier a behavior pattern crystallized to which they referred as "give up it is." In the concentration camps, this behavior was paralleled by those who one morning at 5 refused to get up and go to work instead of staying in the hut, and instead stayed in the hut on the straw wet with urine and feces. Nothing, neither warning nor threats, could induce them to change their minds. And then something typical occurred. They took a cigarette from a deep down in a pocket where they had hidden it and started smoking. At that moment, we knew that for the next 48 hours or so we would watch them dying. Meanwhile, orientation has subsided, and consequently, the seeking of immediate pleasure had taken over. Is it is this not reminiscent of another parallel, a parallel that confronts us day by day? I think of those youngsters who, on a worldwide scale, refers to themselves as as the new future generation. To be sure, it is not just a cigarette to which they resort; it is drugs. In fact, the drug scene is one aspect of a more general mass phenomenon, namely the feeling of meaninglessness resulting from frustration of our existential needs, which in turn has become a universal phenomenon in our industrial societies. Today, it is not only logotherapists who claim that the feeling of meaninglessness play an ever increasing role in the etiology of neurosis, and as Irvin D. Yalom of Stanford University states in the existential psychotherapy of 40 consecutive patients applying for a therapy at a psychiatry outpatient clinic, 12, that is 30%, had some major problem involving meaning as adjust from the self-ratings therapist or independent judges. Thousands of miles east of Palo Alto, the situation diverges only by 1%. The most recent pertinent statistics indicate that in Vienna, 29% of population complain that meaning is missing from their lives. As to the causation of the feelings of meaninglessness, one may say, albeit in an oversimplifying vein, that people had enough to live by but nothing to live for. They have the means but no meaning. To be sure, some do not even have the means. In particular, I think of the mass of the people who are today unemployed. 50 years ago, I published a study devoted to a specific kind of depression I had diagnosed in the cases of a young patient suffering from what I called unemployment neurosis, as I could show that this neurosis really originated in a twofold erroneous identification. Being joblessness was equated with being useless, and being useless was equated with having a meaningless life. Consequently, whenever I succeeded in persuading the patients of to volunteer in youth organizations, adult education, public libraries, and the like, in other words, as soon as they could fill their abundant free time with some sort of unpaid but meaningful activity, their depression disappeared, although their economic situation had not improved and changed, and their hunger was the same. The truth is that man does not live by welfare alone. Along with the unemployment neurosis, which is triggered by an individual's socio-economic situation, there are other types of depression which are traceable back to the psychodynamic or biochemical conditions, which the case may be. Accordingly, psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy, they are indicated respectively in so far as the feeling of the meaninglessness is concerned. However, we should not overlook and forget that per se it is not a matter of pathology rather than being the sign and symptom of being of a neurosis. It is, I would say, the proof of one's humanness. But although it is not caused by anything pathological, it may well cause a pathological reaction. In other words, it is potentially pathogenic. Just consider the mass neurotic symptoms so pervasive in the young generation. There is ample empirical evidence that the three facets of this syndrome, depression, aggression, addiction, are due to what it is called logotherapy, the existential vacuum, a feeling of emptiness and meaninglessness. It goes without saying that not each and every case of depression is to be traced back to a feeling of meaninglessness or not the suicide, in which depression sometimes eventuates, always result from a existential vacuum. But even if each and every case of suicide had not been undertaken out of a feeling of meaninglessness, it may well be that an individual's impulse to take his life would have been overcome had to be aware of some meaning and purpose worth living for. If thus a strong meaning orientation plays a decisive role in the phenomena in prevention of suicide, what about intervention in case in which there is a suicide risk? As a young doctor, I spent 4 years in Austria's largest state hospital where I was in charge of the pavilion in which severely depressed patients were accommodated, most of them having been admitted after a suicide attempt. I once calculated that I must have explored 12,000 patients during the 4 years. What accumulated was quite a store of experience from which I still draw whatever whenever I am confronted with someone who is prone to suicide. I explained to such a person that patients had repeatedly told me how happy they were that the suicide attempt had not been successful. Weeks, months, year later, they told me it turned out that there was a solution to their problem, an answer to their question, a meaning to their life. Even if things only take such a good turn in one of a thousand cases, my explanation continues. Who can guarantee that in your case it will not happen one day sooner or later? But in the first place, you have to live to see the day on which it may happen. So you have to survive in order to see that day down, and from now on, the responsibility for survival does not leave you. Regarding the second facet of the mass neurotic syndrome, aggression, let me cite an experiment one conducted by Caroline Wood Sheriff. She had succeeded in artificially building up mutual aggressions between groups of Boy Scouts and observed that aggressions only subsided when youngsters dedicated themselves to a collective purpose. That is, the joint task of dragging out of a mud a carriage in which food had to be brought to their camp. Immediately, they were not only challenged but also united by a meaning they had to fulfill. As for the third issue, addiction, I am reminded of the findings presented by Annie Marie von Forstmeyer, who first noted that, as evidenced by tests and statistics, 90% of the alcoholics she studied had suffered from a abysmal feeling of meaninglessness. Of the drug addicts studied by Stanley Krimpner, 100% believed that the things seemed meaninglessness. Now, let us start to the question of meaning itself. To begin with, I would like to clarify that in the first place, the logotherapist is concerned with the potential meaning inherent and dormant in all single situations one has to face throughout his life. Therefore, I will not be elaborating here on the meaning of one's life as a whole, although I do not deny that such a long range meaning does exist. To invoke an analogy, consider a movie. It consists of thousands upon thousands of individual pictures of each of them makes sense and carries a meaning. Yet the meaning of the whole film cannot be seen before its last sequence is shown. However, we cannot understand the whole film without having first understood each of its components. each of the individual's pictures, isn't it the same with life? Doesn't the final meaning of life too reveal itself, if at all, only at its end, on the verge of the death? And doesn't this final meaning too depend on whether or not the potential meaning of such each single situation has been actualized to the test of the respective individual's knowledge and belief? So here, I'll just stop reading now, and I will try to sum up the things that he said during the process. So now the author is giving a commentary, an opinion of what he believes how psychoanalysis and meaningless of life works in general, and he talks about the suicide patients and how their psyche is basically driven by the lack of purpose in life, where unemployment is tagged to the uselessness, which is tagged to the free time they have. And once they are given some sort of task, motivation, even the unpaid ones, you see that void is filled. And he also talked about the addiction, like the 80% case of the in 80% of the cases where alcoholics have some sort of void in their life, the existential vacuum, why they exist, and these sort of things actually create an opportunity for the addiction to come into the picture. So here in the next, I think, one or two videos, I'll be talking about this postscript, where that author is talking about the case for a tragic optimism. And I think there are 6 more pages left now, 6 or 7 probably. And in the next 2 videos, I think I'll be wrapping this up. And then in the final 40th video, it will be about the final comment on the book itself. So that was day 37th of my communication practice, and I hope you have enjoyed the journey. I am sure, like, most of the folks are not even watching it, might be get some views after like years, like from now, and then people will see it. But I think this is a good way to record myself and listen to my own voice to understand how I can improve. And this might be also helpful in people, for the people who were at a later stage would want to improve their communication, to see how my journey has been. It's kind of a video journal, and it might get some sort of attention at a later stage, and might help people to motivate them, like how I'm speaking now versus how good I'll be. That's the tragic case of optimism here. I am optimistic about that. So thanks for watching my 37th video. Bye for now.